Esports. They came out of nowhere and are getting bigger every year. For those of you that don't know what esports are, they are video games that people play competitively in tournaments. This seems like a joke to a lot of people, but there is a very large community behind esports. There are large prize pools of money for a lot of games, and the amounts increase every year. Esports is composed of many different games. Some of the main genres are shooters, MOBAs, which are multiplayer online battle arenas, online card games, and sports games. Each of these interact in very different ways, but they all have the same core concepts. This clearly begs the question, are esports real sports? Hi, I'm Elric Mack, and today I'm going to be talking about esports being considered real sports. This may sound pretty funny to a lot of people that this would even be a consideration, but we will have to take a deep look at some of the definitions of esports and sports to really get a good grasp on aspects they share and aspects that they differ in. Many people would consider sports to require a physical aspect. When somebody says sport, what do you think of? The first ones that pop in my mind are basketball, football, and hockey. These are all very physically intense sports. However, when you take a deeper look at some sports, they do not all have a lot of physical activities like basketball or football. Take golf, for example. Golf engages some of the body, but all you're doing is swinging a club once every few minutes. One thing that all sports do have in common is the need for perfect precision and motor control. The main difference between esports and sports is the physical aspect. The movement in esports is less physically taxing, but still needs to be fast and perfect. Think about any shooter game. You have to aim perfectly and be able to move around the map quickly and precisely to be at the top of the competition. Even though esports requires less effort, when fine motor control is involved, the activity is at least somewhat physical. An article from Tandoff Online by Ivo van Hilvoord talks about the fact that esports require motor control that can be found in pretty much all sports. In order to look at more extensively at the physical aspect of esports, we need to look at the metabolic rates that occur in esports. Metabolic rate is a psychological measure of how much energy a physical task consumes. An article from the Sport Journal by Daniel Kane talks about the metabolic rates that players experience in video games. In this article, Kane says that many experiments were conducted on people playing video games, and it was found that playing competitive video games produced the same metabolic rates that moderate physical activity did. If the metabolic rate standard were used, esports would in theory have a physical aspect. Since we have taken a deep look at the physical aspects of esports, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the definitions of esports and sports. I will start off by saying that I do not think that one definition is completely correct. There are many definitions from many places, and none have officially been recognized as a for sure definition. Different countries also define sports in different ways. The definition from the Oxford Dictionary for sports is an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. The definition from the Oxford Dictionary for esports is a multiplayer video game played competitively for spectators, typically by professional gamers. Nowhere in the esports definition does it mention physical activity. Metabolic rates, like I talked about earlier, are not a completely solid foundation for physical activity, so if esports are determined to be not physical, then they cannot follow this definition. To make this more complicated, we will need a definition of physical activity to figure out what truly represents the physical aspect of sports. The World Health Organization defines physical activity as any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that requires energy expenditure. If you think about it, everything that people do is physical activity to some degree. Definitions just simply don't really cover all the bases well. Simply moving a finger to click a mouse is physical activity. Sprinting is also physical activity. There is no standard to divide sports by a certain amount of physical activity. Based on this, I think that esports can actually fit in as sports because the only thing really holding back esports from becoming sports is the physical aspect, but with no solid way to measure physical aspect, sleeping could be considered a sport. Calories are still being burned in sleep and the body is still active, which means that there is physical activity going on. All of this may seem a little far-fetched, but with no clear way to define physical activity, there's just no real way to exclude esports from the definition of sports. Moving away from definitions, the US does something pretty special for esports players that is a fairly convincing argument for the esports side. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for esports being considered sports is that the US gives out athletic visas to professional gamers so that they can come play esports in the US for extended periods of time. Players can usually get these visas to come to the US for 5 years at a time. These visas are given to both sports players and esports players since it is an athletic visa. These visas help bridge the gap between the athletes. This is a good point for esports in the US. Let's talk about something a little more worldwide. A widely recognized gold standard of sports is the Olympics. There are many different sports played in the Olympics, and sports that make it here are pretty solidly considered sports. There has been talk of adding esports to the Olympics, but nothing is final yet. A more important topic of discussion about the Olympics is the fact that they have 35 benchmarks for new sports being added to their events. There is no mention of physical activity anywhere in these 35 benchmarks. Esports qualify to be Olympic sports as it currently stands. I think that it could be interesting to see esports in the Olympics, especially with its boom in popularity as of late. It might even bring more attention to the Olympics. After talking about a lot of evidence from the esports side, let's discuss some of the evidence from the sports side. An article from The Telescope by Bethany Nash talks a lot about the evidence concerning this issue. She talked about the no physical exertion aspect, but also brought up a very interesting point about nonprofit organizations. Pretty much all sports have a connection with nonprofit organizations, whereas esports really don't have any sort of connection usually. She offers the opinion that esports are a competition rather than being a sport. I do think that esports don't really have much connection with nonprofit organizations, but that doesn't seem like a good reason for them not to be sports. Another aspect of the anti-esports argument is that it could be potentially unhealthy for future youth to make esports a sports. Although there is some physicality involved with esports, overall they are not really healthy for people. They can become addictive and do not offer much in the way of exercise. You cannot really become stronger at all by playing esports. Many kids can be driven to spend thousands of hours to get good at these games when they likely will not become professional players. It can be potentially dangerous to make esports sports in this regard. Making esports a sport is definitely a risk, but overall, I don't think that it would really change the esports scene that much by just saying that it is a sport now. It is still fundamentally the same activity, but just with no E at the beginning. I can't predict if more youth would be drawn to it or not, but I don't believe that it would be at an unhealthy level versus what it is now. After discussing some of the main cons for esports, I want to talk a little bit more about esports in colleges. Scholarships are being handed out in some cases to esports athletes. Esports are also an intercollegiate sport and have become official varsity sports in some colleges. More and more colleges are expanding and adopting esports into their competitive community. These college teams practice many hours together, much like a normal sports team. Boise State is one of the frontrunners in college esports. BSU has 6 games that are available for esports players, and good programs for all of them. I actually talked with someone who's on the League of Legends team who plays for BSU. I asked him what he thinks about this issue and why. He says that he does believe esports are sports. He argues that although esports are more of a mental grind than a physical one, they are still physically taxing and require just as much practice to master. Esports teams also frequently have a nutritionist or trainer to keep their bodies in shape. This means that physical fitness is still important in esports. He also brings up an interesting point about community and teamwork. His team works together and practices together just like a sports team would. They are all working hard together to achieve a goal. Overall, I believe that esports can be considered sports. They still have a physical aspect, although it is lower than most sports. Esports athletes can also get athletic visas to come play in the US. This means they are treated on the same field as sports players in this regard. They are even a consideration for Olympics in the future. They can realistically fit into any definition of sports as well because there isn't a good way to define how much physical activity is the minimum requirement for a sport. Based on this, I think a solid definition of esports should be developed under the umbrella of sports. I hope at the very least I made some people think a little bit more about this debate, and that esports are bigger than most people think. Thank you for listening.